All right, so the topic is the race to control the messaging channel for customer service. So specifically for customer service, and that's an important distinction. This is different from how messaging is being used person to person. I find that is a distinction that often gets missed, and then people don't really do the right kind of thinking because they're very, very different use cases. It's restarting. That's great. That's great. So let me just preface this by saying I'm not an expert in the messaging world. That's not the world I live in. My company, Fonolo, is involved in contact center technology. So I'm very involved in contact centers. That's really what I do day in and day out, and I know their struggles, and I know what kind of decisions they are facing. And so these are the kinds of conversations I get pulled into is what's happening with messaging. What should we think about? How should we think about where communications is going in the future with our customers? And so we all know that text is becoming a bigger part of the mix. It's not replacing voice. I got a lot to say about that, but that's another presentation. But text is, are you kidding me? It's doing updates. That's great. That is great. It's 82% complete. I'll keep the audience posted. So we know that text is becoming a bigger part of the mix. We don't know what channel is going to be used to get the text between consumers and the call center, the agent. So we've got three big choices. We've got using some kind of built-in chat function in a native application, a mobile app. But as the distinguished speaker who came before me pointed out, the adoption rate for those apps is very, very poor. So that's really been a non-starter for everyone. It's pretty much not, people realize you can't count on that. So we've got two other options. We've either got SMS or we've got using one of the major platforms that are out there. So I'm talking about the platforms provided by Facebook, Google, or Apple. So Facebook has Messenger and WhatsApp, of course. And Google has a number of initiatives, but the one that's most relevant to us is the Google My Business initiative. And Apple, of course, has iMessage. Now, each of them has their own strengths that they bring to this battle, and so they've got to fight the war differently. Apple obviously has the advantage that they control hardware and software and OS, and so they have that whole stack. But their disadvantage is you have to own an Apple device, and that's really only about half the population in the US, and less if you're talking internationally. So my computer's back. That's all right. I'll just keep talking. I'll multitask here. So they've got strengths and weaknesses. Google obviously has the strength of Android's very, very broad adoption, but very poor adoption of their hardware devices, and so they're kind of at the mercy of what the hardware people want to do for them. And then Facebook has, the strength of its very dominant social networks, both WhatsApp and Facebook itself and Messenger. But they, again, are at the mercy of the hardware guys. So it's a very interesting battle to watch, and I've enjoyed watching it. Now I'm going to plug this in, and we'll see if we get some slides. Now, one of the secondary effects of having these three waging a war is that there's become an opportunity for companies to show up and be an abstraction layer between the three and the kinds of the companies that want to use these channels. So basically, companies have shown up and said, we will be a layer between these three, and so you can write to that single layer. And that's become a lucrative business. There was a Montreal-based company called Smooch, just acquired by Zendesk, that did a great job doing this. And I know Nexmo has some functionality around this. Twilio made a big deal about this very specific function in their latest conference. Their CEO was part of his opening remarks, their Twilio Conversations product. And he had those three, the three big players I mentioned on the screen when he pointed at them and said, we're fixing this particular problem. And there are a few others. Spark Central, 24/7 are also doing this. So they're tackling both the problem of an abstraction layer, so you can pretend there's just one rather than three, and they're also tackling the problem of sessions, which you don't have, or they aren't treated the same way across all three. Or if you want to do SMS, you don't have sessions at all. So that's a good thing that we've got a number of options for doing the abstraction layer, but what is still remaining as a real problem is the discovery problem. And so this is the question of how, as a consumer, can you figure out which channel a company is using. So if I don't know anything about a particular company, how do I know if I can send them a text message, or what number to use? Or are they on Facebook? Or can I connect to them through Apple Business Chat? Or can I connect? So you get the point. And this is a real problem. This is the on-ramp problem. How do you know which company is on which channel? So this has become a real battleground for the companies. And so one of the places it's manifested is in these search results. And you see here the Google version and the Apple version. And it's funny because those two little icons that say message seem so innocent and innocuous. They just seem like they belong with all those other icons. But behind them, a war is waging, which is really interesting. Because remember, Google pays a lot of money to Apple to be their default search engine. So Google is obviously not going to be happy if on a search results page, a consumer finds a business but then clicks through and they're brought to Apple Maps, where they're presented the Apple chat rather than Google's chat, right? So I'm sure there are many heated discussions happening on this front. So the next logical question is, okay, well, who's gonna win? How's this gonna play out? What's it gonna look like 5 years from now, 10 years from now? And at least in North America, it seems to me like none of these three are going to get to a real critical mass. Meaning, and by critical mass, what I mean is being so dominant that it's just assumed that you just know as a consumer that any particular business will be on platform X. In the same way, we just assume they all have 1-800 numbers today. And so if none of them are going to reach that kind of dominance, that kind of critical mass, really the winner by default is our old friend SMS. And so what I see more than anything else right now are deployments that pretty much default to SMS. And the presentation before me showed you, the many advantages of using SMS. And so my forecast, to the extent I'm going to make one at all, is that SMS continues to be the winner in this game. Now, I had here on this slide a little sentence about RCS, which is the supposed successor, but in my lunchtime discussion with the Brain Trust, convinced me that I don't know what to say I'm not sure what to think about RCS. I'll have a conversation with a Google person who will convince me that this is the year. They've got it figured out. And then I'll talk to some other people who will have the opposite opinion. So I'm not going to say anything about RCS. But in the panel that follows this, I will ask. And the good news is I get to be the moderator, so I don't have to have an opinion. And I'll put everybody else on the spot, and they can tell me what they think is happening with SMS. All right, so it's very tempting to ask the question, who's winning this war? How can we know when it's won? How can we track this trend? And it turns out that it's actually quite difficult to figure out what the numbers are like. And the reason is you can find a lot of data, and often it's not bad data, it's good data, but it's not really answering the question you think it's answering. So a lot of presentations around messaging and customer service, people selling chat, people selling chatbots, people selling these abstraction layers I talk about, they'll show you this or something similar. Look at all these people using messaging apps. And, this data is real. I assume it's real. I assume people aren't lying. But, this is not really telling you, not really answering the same question. Because first of all, to be an active user of a messaging app, it doesn't cost anything as a consumer. So if you've got one buddy who's on WhatsApp or whatever, you'll install it. It doesn't cost you anything. Secondly, your behavior in interpersonal communication really doesn't tell us anything about what you're willing to do to communicate with a company. So this is not, these charts aren't that useful. This image kind of supports why the previous image isn't that useful and is an example in its own right of the kinds of images that aren't that useful. There's this great geographic variety of which messaging network is popular in which country. And this is kind of neat to look at, so from a sociology perspective. But really, from a practical point of view, all you care about are the country you're in and the countries your company is active in. And there aren't many companies that need to have truly global reach. Even companies that are multinationals usually have divisions that are separate for different regions of the world. So although it's interesting that there's lots of different colors, if you're a North American company, WeChat doesn't really matter. And if you're in China, WeChat is all that matters. So this doesn't really help us with the core question. This is another common one, and I left off the legend because you guys have seen this and you know what it's talking about. The green is the phone calls, and the other colors are other things, right? So this is the type of chart that comes out all the time that shows us how new modes of communication are showing up and how interactions are shifting away from phone calls and emails into all these other exciting new things. And I talk to call center people, and they bring this up, and they want to make plans. The problem with these charts is that, and they're made in good faith. I mean, let's assume that everyone is trying to, do their best. No one's trying to trick you. But the problem is, we don't have a way to count interactions. So it's not really meaningful to tell me that 80% of interactions are on the phone or 50% of interactions are going to be over non-voice channels. Because if I call a company, I might ask 3 or 4 things. Are we counting each of them separately? If I go to the website and I check, what hours you're open, and I check if something's in stock, and then maybe I place an order, are we counting each thing separately as an interaction? And so we don't have a common definition. And that makes these kinds of charts really difficult to give us meaning. The other weird thing about these is that they often have strange groupings for how they count interactions. So they'll have chat in one thing, but social in another. And not sure what they mean by social, because I guess they're counting people that are interacting over Twitter. But I think if you're using Twitter to directly message your company back and forth, you shouldn't really count that as social. That's just another chat channel. So I find that really odd. So I'm just pointing out things to look out for when you're looking at these charts that come up, not to just have these ideas in mind before you place too much weight on them. This is another one that comes up all the time, the Cohort Study. And people will say, look at these young kids and how different their uses of channels are. These young kids, they don't pick up the phone at all anymore, and they hate email. And then the next thought is, well, just imagine it all shifting over, and then in 10 years, what's over on this side is what's going to be the dominant mode for middle-aged people who are your target audience. And again, let's assume the data is real and people are collecting it in good faith or whatever. The problem is that when you're younger, your priorities are different, and the things you need to do are different, and you value your time differently. So 6 to 15-year-olds, I don't know what it is that, what kind of tasks they have, but they don't need to call their insurance company for a quote, right? So yeah, they're not emailing and making phone calls. They're doing their Snapchat stuff and their TikTok stuff and whatever. So that same person, when he's 45 or when she's 45, is going to have different priorities and different tasks. And I don't think we should put so much weight on this being some kind of predictor of the future. Anyway, just one of my pet peeves, the Cohort Study. So I know I probably haven't provided that many solid answers, but hopefully I've pointed out some ways that you can ask smarter questions about this. And it is a really important trend in customer service. So definitely something worth keeping an eye on. So that is the presentation. I'm happy to take any questions.
Excellent. Any questions for Shai? Dean, you mean you don't have a question? Wait a sec.
Uh-oh.
I think the point you made about counting interactions is very good. I think that most telecom operators don't really know why people use different interactions. Do you, I mean, I've asked before, it's like, why do people make phone calls? And got a blank look, like I hadn't analyzed it. Are there any good ways we could try to collect that data to make more informed decisions?
Yeah, it's a great question. It reminds me a little bit of when we used to count clicks or page loads in the early days of the internet before we realized that wasn't a very good metric for anything. But yeah, this is a big blind spot for people. One thing I do see on the horizon is as people are using speech analytics to extract value from phone calls, we're getting to the point where they can take phone calls and actually figure out what all the interactions are. So right now we just do that sort of anecdotally. You can survey the agents and they'll say, these are the reasons people are calling. But we're getting to a point where we can do that systematically and we can get a real breakdown of here are all the reasons people call. And more importantly, so right now people, usually the agent after the call, part of the post-call cleanup work is what was the reason for the call? And they usually get to put one reason. But we all know when you call, it's usually not that simple because we're not calling for simple reasons, right? We've got all the self-serve options. So if you're picking up the phone to call an agent, it's usually because you've tried self-serve or you've got some kind of edge case, right? That's what ends up in the call center these days is all the complicated stuff. And so the complicated stuff is usually not in the little drop-down that the agent has, and the agent usually ends up clicking other. And so the data just says, well, 60% is other. So that's not useful. Anyway, hopefully we're getting to the point where we can classify calls more accurately, I guess is the answer.
Just to comment on, what they're trying to do in the call centers. They're actually trying to get to the point of finding out whether or not they've, shuffled the person to 5 different people, right? And what the heat of the customer is on the other side of that. So we're actually looking at, whether or not they can actually get to that person's problem faster than shuffling them through 5 different people to get to their answer. So that's why they need to take advantage of these things and put that on top of their switching systems, their voice translators, and those other things.
Yeah.
I'm optimistic. I've seen it working in Australia, but haven't seen it here yet.
Yeah, I mean, one of the biggest frustrations with contact centers is being transferred between agents. And I guess the only consolation is they hate that as much as you do because it means their costs are up, right? So that's a fail for both sides, right? So you can take some solace that they're feeling that pain too.